Alright, Facebook, we're back. Working on this rack that we've been talking about over a couple of videos now. So, we discussed the base parts that hold the batteries. Then we started discussing getting it tied down to the frame correctly to where it's strong and tied to the frame and not the body. Now we are working on, let me flip you around, our crossbar. Don't mind the welding jacket for tack welding purposes with carpet in the trunk. That's a safety precaution, plus saves the carpet while we're welding. So, we have now put in our crossbars. We have welded our pipe that ties to the pipe of the frame. Haven't drilled the holes yet, but they're indexed, they're in, they slide in and out good on both sides. We took that piece of 2x2 we were talking about, cut it down, have now tied it in, tacked it in place on both sides. Now, when you go to put your crossbar to your sides, I've already taken the trusty level and angle finder and put onto that front to back runner, that front to back runner, made sure they were level, like we talked about, level. They're level. Then we set in the crossbar after we measured and cut it to size. Now a little tip for you when you go to set this crossbar. These clamps work great. Got a large head on the top, large footprint on the bottom. You can actually go underneath your front to back and you can clamp your crossbar to it and make it where that crossbar pipe will be flush on the top, flush on the bottom, on both sides. If you don't have those trusty clamps, you ordered a hydraulic kit. It's probably going to have something like donuts, upper coilover cups, front cups, rear cups. Use what you got. Set them in, set them on the floor, rest your crossbar in, start adding donuts, do what you need to do to get it butted up square and level with this pipe. Check your angle finder. We're level side to side. Check your bubble. I've got a light on it so I can see, because you know I'm about blind, supposed to be wearing glasses. I'm not today, but make sure that your rack mounted on your front to back bar, touching your crossbar, your front to back bar. Now, I set these in, mocking things up. I took measurements here to trunk, from this side to this side, from that point to that point. Then I went from that point to this point, that point to this point, to make sure that those were square. Make sure they aren't tilted and off. Make sure they're the same distance to the trunk. That way, when it's set in, they're going to be straight. They're going to be straight. Side to side distance is the same. Cadillacs are great. They put this one little bolt sticking up here to help hold carpet in. That is a perfect reference point for dead center. So you can measure then from there to this rack, and from there to this rack, and make sure that your batteries are centered to the center of the car. Now, another thing that works good, these boogers. They're a lifesaver with what we do. Then you can set it in, rest it against your crossbar, rest it against your rack, and know, even though measure twice, cut once, measure twice, weld once, this tells you that you are square to your crossbar, and then with your measurements, if all of those match, you know that's square, you know that's square. Now, I'm going to tell you, these front to backs are not always perfectly straight. A lot of these frame rails in these cars, they'll come back, they'll loop up over the rear end, and then they do a curve and a kickback. This side will do a comeback, a curve out, a kickback. When the car companies built these cars, their measurements and tolerances are a lot less perfect than you would expect. They mount these bodies on rubber bushings for a couple reasons. One, they want to have give in the body from the frame so that you don't have too much flex in chassis to body that would create buckling, warping, what have you, in a traditional car aspect. And I say that as they don't build these cars with the intention to do what we do with these cars. So their tolerances can be off and the car still be right. For us, for me personally, I want to be a lot more precise with what I'm doing. So these frame rails running from the back bumper up won't always be straight. They might be tilted and angle in as they get up where they need to go next. Well, mind you, we're tying to the frame. So even though the frame rail might not be straight and might not be running completely perfect from the back of the trunk to the front of the trunk, that's okay. That's okay. So just to show you, if you look at this rack and you look close from here to this point, from here to this point, they aren't exactly even, right? You look back here, this side looks a little narrower than this side. That frame rail is a little bit off. I did my best to measure side to side and get them as close as I could, but I needed that mounting point to be on the top of the frame with full contact on the frame. I didn't want part of that pipe hanging off the frame where you can see gap and you can't get a good weld. Solid structure, remember, solid. You want to weld all the way around that pipe to that frame. So if those forward bars are slightly canted, like this one, this side of the frame, let me show you. This side of the frame, here to here, this one really, and it doesn't really show in the camera, it's got a good little tweak in it. But batteries sit on that, right? You'll never physically see this. But you do see if the batteries are square and straight in the car. You do see if your crossbar is crooked or straight. Then we're going to mount pumps to it. We want the pumps to look square, right? So we square up everything here. What's underneath it is a structure point. It can be off as long as everything above it is square, because you want those tie-in points to tie in on the frame solid. So your bar underneath might be slightly off. As long as what you set on top of it and your tie-in is all square together and centered to your trunk, it's still going to work, it's going to look, and it's going to perform like it's supposed to. So don't get scared when you do your tie-ins and you lay your first piece in and you go, oh God, that looks crooked. Well, it's because the frame underneath probably is going that direction. That's okay. That served its purpose. That tied you into the frame, solid to the frame. You got to follow that frame. That frame might not be completely straight, coming back into what you need to be straight in this trunk. That's okay. It's tied in, it's solid. Then we put our crossbar in. I set it where I wanted it in this car, so we still had room up front. Hell, if he still wanted to put the factory spare in there, or down the road buy a wire wheel and put it up there so that he's got a spare, he can. If he wants to throw a box in there, he can. Puts all of his hydraulics back here. Now, I will tell you, pumps farther back in a trunk in some of these bigger cars. A lot of these hydraulic companies over the years, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when you order a kit, 2 4-foot hoses in the rear, you usually got 20-foot hoses for the front. Not anymore. Now, 15, 16 is kind of standard. So a lot of times, having to route this stuff from the front of the car to the trunk and doing it where you can tie things up, you don't have hoses sagging, you sometimes don't have enough hose. Keep that in mind with your placement of stuff in your trunk. I've learned to get around that a little bit because a lot of what we do, we really try and beautify these trunks. So even if the hose that goes from the front to the back is only a 15-footer, it will get you to the trunk. It might not get you to where you want to be to hook to the pump, but it'll get you to the trunk. Then we do beauty boards, we do bulkhead fittings, we hook and connect hard lines from there and run the hard line back to where we need to go to get to the pump. Another option is, a guy like me building these, I can take that 15-foot hose out of that kit, put it on the shelf, set it aside for another car that might be a shorter car, we might be doing hard lines on, and then I'll just have 2 front hoses made that are going to be long enough to get where I need them to hook to the pumps. So if you don't have that option, you don't want to go and spend that extra money and then have 2 useless hoses because they're too short. Think about placement of where you're going to put stuff to make everything that you bought work. So we've got our base. Our structure is in. It's all tacked together. Remember, if you're following my stuff and you're watching my videos, you've heard me talk about mock-up. You've heard me talk about putting it together, taking it apart, putting it together, taking it apart. I do that a lot. So you saw me put the front to back rails in the last video, set the rack pieces in, kind of figure out where I wanted stuff to sit. Wanted to make sure that when this rack's set in, that pesky trunk arm, as it comes down, isn't going to hit a battery sitting right here. So I've already set one in, brought it down, made sure I'm not going to have clearance issues there. Pulled them out, set my crossbar in, started doing some measuring to make sure if I want to set pumps here, or if I want to put pumps here, that I have room to either bring them to the back. I could do them at an angle. I could go sideways. I've got it configured how I want it now. So now I've gone in and I've tacked stuff together. I've got the crossbar tacked to the front to backs. I'm getting ready to go ahead and tack the actual rack bases to this. We're going to tack it here. I'm going to tack it here. I'm going to tack it up there. I'm going to do the same over here. I'm going to tack, tack, and tack. Once this is all tacked together good, then I can pull this rack up and out, take it out of the car, and get it all welded up. Then I'm going to set it back in again. Make sure that when you put heat to this metal, sometimes it will expand, sometimes it'll contract, sometimes it throws things off a little bit. So you want to continually be checking with the steps that you're doing that things are still fitting right, things are still squaring up right, they're still where you want them. You still have level, all that comes into play with every step. You're welding, you're fitting, as you're adding stuff into here, you want to make sure all that still works. Once I get all this welded, it'll come back in, get set back down. We'll get everything, making sure it's still all level and good. Then I'll go in and I'll drill my holes for my bolts to run grade 8 or grade 10 bolts through these rack mounts to hold this thing in solid. Then we'll start building pump stands. We'll figure where we want to put solenoids, which, again, if you've watched my videos, I hate seeing a ton of wiring. I hate seeing all these extra components that just make a trunk look cluttered. I've calculated for room back here. I think that's where we're going to put the solenoids on this one. We're going to tuck them back in. They will still be accessible, but the wiring can drop down and under. I'll weld some studs to where the wiring can be hooked and held in where it needs to be. Then one of these points will be where our switch wiring comes back to tie into all of this. Let's say I put a pump here, say I put a pump here. Now you got dump wires that drop down. Those can hit those same studs and tie that wiring up underneath the rack. And then a couple of things you can do. You can run under the rack because there's room under there. Weld some studs under there. Bring your wiring, run it underneath, get you to this side, meets with this wiring. Then it runs up to the front. Keep it hidden. I have done before, I'm not going to on this one, but before you tack this together, if you mark where it needs to go, you could actually go into the side of that tube and drill or cut you a place where you could come in with wiring through the side, bring it up in the tube, fish it across, come out the tube, and boom, there's your wiring. Then you don't have all this wiring laying, you know. I'm sure everybody's seen. We've all seen. You open or have people open trunks, check out their setups. Looks like a rat's nest of wiring. Nothing tied up, or if it is, it's 9 million zip ties, or they've bunched up a bunch of extra wire because they didn't cut it to actually fit where it needed to go. They just utilized what was there, put a butt connector on it, ran wire, and they got all this jumble of wire. It'll make a setup that actually could be very simple, clean, and decent, and just makes it look cluttered. So, like I said, always be thinking a couple of steps ahead as you're doing this stuff. Where are you going to put your solenoids? Where are you going to mount your pumps? When you get to your wiring, how are you going to run your wiring? Do you want to run it inside? Do you want to run it outside? Do you want to weld? I take up massive stock in little short 1/4 inch bolts because you can rest the head right against your tubing or underneath your tubing, weld around that head, and then you have all that threaded stud that you can put a nice clean, you know, insulated loop terminal, and you can run all that wiring, tie it all up and tuck it up where you don't see any of it. It's not hanging down, it's not in the way, it doesn't look cluttered, and really clean up a setup with just a little thought ahead of time of placement for stuff to be able to execute a really clean installation with a few minimal steps extra. Studs, you know, a lot of guys who use self-tappers. I'll tell you with self-tappers, they don't make them like they used to. Talking earlier about quality materials, quality metal, 3/16 1/4 inch. How many of us back in the day, maybe yesterday, have mounted solenoids to a rack with self-tappers? You run it in, it holds. You have to replace the solenoid. You run it out, you go to run it back in. You didn't really think about replacing those once you took them out, because when you run them back in, you've already probably stretched them a little when you ran it down and that drill went bang, bang. So you pull them out, change out a solenoid, go to put it back together, run it in, snap. Uh-oh. Now you got a broke off self-tapper. You might have got lucky, broke off flush. But there's only so much width in the hole of that solenoid foot. You're going to be able to continue to do that when you need to until you just ain't got no real estate left. Then what happens? Then you see those trunks where one screw is holding a solenoid on instead of two. Or they've broke off enough, let's say in the middle solenoid, that now only the bolts on the outer two solenoids are holding the whole bank in. That creates ground problems. We'll get into that stuff later, but grounds is a big thing with hydraulics. You want good ground for your solenoids. You want good ground for your pumps. Just like your car. If you unhook the ground off your car and then jump in and try and start it, nothing. Hook the ground up, start it, boom, fires up. You have a bad ground or a loose ground, you start having voltage issues. You might start having newer cars, computer issues. Ground is a big thing. It is with hydraulics too. You want good grounds. Guys like me that do all the pretty crap and the powder coating and the painting, it opens a whole new world to grounding issues if you don't think ahead of time what you're going to do to combat the problem you just made by taking a rack and painting it or powder coating it, and now the only ground contact you're getting is that screw or that bolt holding it to the rack, but 90% of, let's say, your solenoid foot is resting on paint or resting on powder coat. And let's say you drilled and tapped to put bolts on your solenoids to bolt them to your rack. And you did that before you powder coated, or you did that before you painted. And you're not thorough that after you're done, you run a tap back through those to clean that up, to create some sort of ground. And you just put the bolt in and you get lucky and it threads in and you run it down. But there's still powder coat or there's still paint that is creating a poor ground. They make really cool little washers that have lots of teeth on them. Those will come in real handy, and we'll show you in the future when we get to that. Pumps, solenoids, I mean, they have uses. Now, I'm going to show you some ways that I do some stuff that you can paint it, you can make it pretty, you can powder coat it, you can chrome, you can do whatever. You're still going to have good ground. We'll get into that in future videos. But back to what we're doing today. Getting a rack in, solid, structural, reliable, dependable. We're getting there. Forwards are done. Cross is tacked in. Now to the point. Oh, safety. Remember, safety first. Get you a heat blanket. Get you something that if you've got carpet in the trunk, if you've got stereo equipment, if you've got, hell, you're doing it in your driveway and the dang thing got leaves and stuff, anything that can create fire, you might want to put something in there to stop that from happening. While you're having to tack stuff in and know it's right, and know it's square, put something down. Takes a couple extra seconds. A lot of us, might not have a welding jacket. They do come in handy when we do work like this, because underneath side stuff we have to do, man, those sparks really hurt when they run down your shirt or run down your pant leg or get in your shoe. The jackets help. It's a safety thing. But, so this one is pretty much mocked in. I'm getting ready to pull it out, weld it up, and I'll stick it back in. Now, while I've got it out, I'm going to go ahead and make what I do for lower mounting points for this rack. Because I like to paint, I like to powder coat and do all that stuff. I'm not just going to take a piece of all thread and just weld to the rack so that you've got all thread sticking up. I'm going to take an all thread connector nut that's about that long. It's got the threads inside to run your all thread in. And they come shaped just like a nut, they're just long. But they will rest right against the rack, give you a good solid mounting point to be able to weld down both sides. Then you can thread your all thread down into it, and when you go to paint or powder coat or whatever, you can take the all thread off. That way the all thread stays nice and clean. The threads don't get boogered up with paint and powder coat and everything else. But you can powder coat that bottom piece and it be clean and nice just like the rack, or painted, what have you, chromed, whatever. So I'm going to probably get those put on while I have this out and I'm welding everything up. When I do those, When you set that battery in, you know you got a post on this side and you got a post over here on this side, but you're pretty much wide open in the middle of that battery. So if you measure from the inner edge of this rack to the inner edge of this side of the rack and mark your center, you can actually put that and weld it right there, and you'll have a perfectly straight bar that can hold those batteries down. You don't want the batteries jumping out. These cars move around a lot. You want them to be just like everything else you're doing. Reliable, safe, structural. Put a good tie down in there to hold them batteries down. You guys that like them ratchet straps to hold stuff down, man, get away from that. Get away from that. The all thread, even if you want to do the basic top hold down bar and do a small piece of 1x1, you know, you don't have to do 3/16 or quarter on them hold downs. I do a lot of them out of aluminum because I like to polish them up, make them look pretty. But I mean, you can do 1x1. You can do angle iron. You know, there's been a million ways that hold downs are done. We'll show some of those options in the future as well. But make sure you have a good solid hold down that holds those batteries in tight. I'm going to weld the bases on while I have this apart. Then I'm going to start playing with solenoid mounts and pump mounts. That'll be the next video. I know these are going to be long and drawn out because I just can't keep it playing while I'm working, but trying to inform you guys as I go what we got going. So I'm going to get this out, get it welded up. I'm going to start cutting the stuff that I need for solenoid mounts, pump stands, what have you. And then I'll be back and show you some more. See y'all in a while. Bye.